of re-embodiment, of an embodiment of consequences, that karma, operating as the law of compensation, is keeping charge of the individual. We are all in school. And if in school we flunk a course, we have to come back and do it again. And we will generally keep on flunking it until we pass. And this seems to be the way life is built here. We cannot condemn an individual for a single failure. We cannot convict the ignorant for not knowing what the wise know. We cannot convict individuals born in various circumstances beyond our understanding for mistakes that we might not make, but they naturally will make. So out of it all, it seems that the only answer is to come back and finish the business where it started. This being considered reasonable, where do we go to get more information on the subject? Well, probably the best place to go for it is the place it came from, and that is the great stream of tradition that has descended from the mysteries of the past and worked its way across the world for nearly 1 million years. A tremendous concept of existence. Now, this main stream, of course, had to mingle with all the local folklore, folk religions, local beliefs, the magic and taboos of primitive peoples, the speculations of sophisticates. All these had to be included among those who needed this doctrine. And so the processes of filtrating it into the life of modern man has been, for the most part, benevolent and successful. So it comes to the more immediate moral consequence. The individual today, we all know, is a compound creature. He consists not only of a body, but of a mind, a soul, a consciousness, a spirit. There is something inside of him that is more than the body. Now, when that something inside of the individual departs therefrom, we have no reason to assume that life dies because the body does. We know that there are various circumstances that moderate bodily survival. In this material world, the pressures of circumstance, especially from the outside, or reactions to circumstances from the inside, make it virtually impossible for the physical body to endure indefinitely. It is worn out by the frictions of physical relationships. It is worn out by the pressures of wars, disasters, plagues, poverty, crime. The whole material world gradually wears out, but for the individual. But there is no reason to assume that the life in the individual dies with the body. If the life dies with the body, we have a total zero for everything. There is nothing more, nothing less. Whatever we did learn is meaningless. Whatever we should have learned is meaningless. And there is no chance to improve the situation. But with the doctrine of reincarnation or rebirth, we discover or decide that the human being divides essentially in two parts, that part which is mortal and that part which is immortal. The immortal part is vested in a mortal fabric, but this vesting can be separated. It is quite possible for the immortal part to survive the disintegration of mortality. Of course, there is a little comfort in some of the things that we find in records of history. We know there are cases in which apparently a person has totally died, and after several days or several weeks has come back to life. And nearly always the story is the same. What happened to them was completely different from anything in their material existence. But that part of the story is very much alike everywhere. Of course, you can bring against this the argument that as long as there was capacity to come back, death was not total. This problem has, of course, interested and influenced a great many thinkers in this particular field of research. But for all intent and practical purposes, we choose to believe that the divine part in us, which was derived from God, is not mortal and therefore cannot die. If there is an immortal part, it must either survive or it must return to the God from which it came. The individual cannot, with a clear conscience, assume that the spiritual values, the divine principles that exist in nature and in himself cease utterly, and that the labor of creating a human being, the most elaborate structure nature has ever been able to create among mortal things, that this is to be disintegrated after a relatively short time, and not a vestige remains. It seems therefore wiser to assume, as it has been assumed in Asia and in Egypt and in many parts of Europe, that there are two bodies also. And in this we come very close to the philosophy of Emerson and Thoreau. Emerson was quite aware of the fact that there has to be two kinds of bodies. One is a body of mortality. That is the body that goes with death. It includes the physical nervous system, the vital body, certain parts of the emotional nature, and the lower mind. When this is stripped off, however, the reality is not affected in any way. With the death of the body, the reality in man never dies. That which survives, then, retires into a subjective state. Now, the condition of this subjective state and its locale these have been considered in many ways by different people. The tendency, however, today is to believe that survival is by the individual retiring into the eternal part of himself, from which he cannot die. Therefore, instead of thinking of him primarily as going someplace outside, thinking of having another stellar summerland where he can drift around while he is out of the body, the wisest of thinkers in these directions assume that he retires into himself. And as he retires into himself and leaves the body behind, he finds that he is retiring into something infinitely greater than the body that he left behind. That here within himself are all the principles, all the causes, all the elements that explain his mortality. Here are the sources of every impulse, every attitude. Here also is a great building plan, a spiritual architecture, by means of which the divine Creator molds the inner life of the individual by a series of sequent embodiments. So if we wish to assume for the moment that we are not going to cause an overflowing of the conditions in the afterlife, we're not going to suddenly find ourselves in a condition that is going to be worse than 47th Street and 5th Avenue in New York. We are not going to be part of an ever-increasing mass of the dead. We are not going to go on forever, increasing the numbers on the other side. Because the other side, as we begin to investigate more deeply, is the inner side. The side that, strangely enough, unfolds into a universe almost as great as space itself. The inner life of the individual is infinitely greater, infinitely more important than the physical life. But in this inner life, there are experience problems. The inner life is growing through the outer. It is growing in the sense it is transforming potentials into potencies. It is transforming the ideas of reality into the exact acts of reality. Therefore, Lord Bacon summarized this process as one of the four great keys. In other words, experience. Experience is the proof of all things. Experience in science is called experiment, and in man's inner life it is called growth. So man, in his search for realities, retiring into his own nature, discovers to his amazement that he is the captain of his own soul. He has the power to make the decisions that are important. He has debts to pay that he must pay. He has new plans to make that he will make. He is searching for greater understanding of the realities of things, an understanding that for a time at least he must gain through contact with material existence. So to the ancient people, re-embodiment was a continuation of a process of schooling. It was the individual gradually coming to master the manifestations of his own nature. He was here to grow, and growth is simply the release of the inside. Growth is not the result of eating more. Growth is the result of becoming more through the development of inner life. And spiritual integrities and many symbols represent the wonderful elixir of life, the universal medicine, by which finally all the restrictions, limitations, and imperfections of human nature are reconciled. So if we are the master of our own soul, and if we are not, who is responsible for us? Are we to assume that God is responsible for our mistakes? Are we to assume that we were born imperfect by a divine edict? Do we wish to assume that there is no guidance to prevent us from going wrong whenever weakness of temperament steps in? The answer is no. It is much more complicated than that, and yet infinitely simple. The whole problem is to become gradually, happily adjusted to the inner life. The individual must gradually know that the sole purpose is the soul, and that in this realization he gradually enters into communion with the greatest part of his self. So having this thought in the base of his mind, he begins to recognize that it may be covered by various veils for a long time, but whatever it is and wherever it is, it will be always the gradual release of the inner through the outer. If this release is too fast, it will destroy the outer. A great many people trying to do metaphysical exercises for development develop rates of vibration that destroy their lives, giving them sickness and mental and emotional imbalance. You have to grow naturally. Growth is something that physically is a biological process, and metaphysically is a psychological process. But it is something that has to develop quietly, and it is something that has to be supported by a greater and greater insight and understanding of the circumstances involved in the life pattern of every living thing. If the inner life grows naturally, that means that the person is developing the integrities that will make possible the release of the inner life. Now, these integrities are covered by such disciplines as the Ten Commandments, or the 8 Commandments of Buddhism for temporal persons, or for the words of Christ, or for the teachings of Muhammad. All of these teachings of a moral and ethical nature are intended to enrich the individual's realization of universal truths. If he keeps the 10 Commandments, the lower part of his life becomes purified, redeemed, and regenerated. The more perfectly he lives here, the more he keeps the rules, the more the soul inside is able to move outward. Therefore, moral integrities have as their basis the conduct of the individual, and as their consequences, the release of the inner life. Now, if the release of the inner life starts fairly well, we know that in the midst of it we're going to be cut down. War comes, pestilences hit us, earthquakes destroy things, famines, all these things, and wherever else fails, disease and sickness move in. There seems to be no way to perpetuate the body beyond a certain point. The actual fact seems to be, at least, that when the inner life realizes that the inner life's needs are no longer possible to the body, then the inner life begins to retire from the body. When this is in a normal and natural way, it is not a great disaster. But to those who have not produced or not understood or have not an inner life to strengthen them, all things that are unpleasant are disasters.